My name is Marie-Pierre Hulloa, and I'm the Senior Executive Officer for the International Programs at the Humanities Center. And I'm one of the initiator of this series with my colleagues, my partners in crime, Elisabeth Bohy, who is professor of French and Italian and of comparative literature at Stanford and an expert in Francophone literature, and Vered Shemtov, who is the Heva Chernov-Loki Senior Lecturer in Hebrew Language and Literature at Stanford and the former co-director of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies. So this series of talks seeks to highlight narratives of Jewish identities originating from France and the Maghreb. And the speakers of the series will address in their presentation conflicting and coexisting identities and the ways in which they are presented in literature and history, specifically how the French, the Moroccans, Tunisians, and the Algerians cast the Jew as the other or not, and how they create cultural, in their writings, cultural constructions of the Jew, how these markers of otherness are dealt with in French, Moroccan, Tunisian, and Algerian literature and history. And the later one, the case of Algeria, will be addressed during our second part of the series, which will take place on May 3rd. And our speaker will be then Denis Cohen-Tanouji, who is the head of the Society for Tunisian Jewish History, and he will discuss the family trajectory of the Cohen-Tanouji through North Africa. So the rationale behind the series is to present a more inclusive, rich, and complex perspective on the unique interplay between Jewish, French, and Maghrebi identities. So before I yield the floor to my colleague Vered Shemtov, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our co-sponsors for the series, the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies, the Mediterranean Studies Forum, DLCL, the Division of Literature, Cultures and Languages, the French and Italian Department, the Comparative Literature Department, the Stanford Humanities Center, and the Toby Center for Jewish Studies. And special thanks go to Linda Wynn and the Toby Center staff, the students who helped us, Fatoumata Sek and Lucas Ko, and also to Christine Honorato from the French and Italian department, my colleagues here at the Humanities Center, Rachel Knowles, Priyanka Sumanadasa, and Najwa Salameh. And last but not least, I would like to thank the poster designer, Tama Inba, who did a great job of creating a gorgeous poster. So please help me welcome my friend and colleague Vered Shemtov.
Good evening. I have to say that I am really excited to see everybody here, but especially our students that are taking exams today. Some of them are taking the exam today at 7, one of their exams, and they're here, so very exciting. Emanuela Trevisan Semi is professor of modern Hebrew and Jewish studies at the University of Venice, Foscari University. Her research focuses on Karaites in Egypt and in Israel, on Jews of Ethiopia and the Jews of Morocco in the modern period. Some of her publications include a recent book that she wrote with Hanan Sekat Khatimi entitled, and I'm translating from French, Memory and Representations of Jews in Morocco, The Missing Neighbors of Meknes. It was published in 2011 in Paris. In 2007, she published with Valentine Mitchell Press in London a book on Jacques Fatilovich and the Jews of Ethiopia. Before that, she was the co-author. She wrote together with Professor Parfit a book on Judaizing movements published in London in 2002. And in 1992, she published a book on the Karaites. Again, I'm translating Karaites, Another Judaism, Paris with Albin Michel. This long list of books. It does not include all of her publications. She also wrote a lot of articles and co-edited books, including a book on Aleph Bet Yoshua and Hebrew literature. Professor Trevisan Semi and Foscari University in Venice worked with us last year to put together a huge conference on David Grossman and the reception of Hebrew literature in Europe. And we thank her for her wonderful hospitality there and are really grateful for the opportunity to have her here. We thank her for accepting the invitation. It's really an honor for us to host you. The title of her talk today is Do Moroccans Share the Nostalgia of the Jews from Morocco for a Mythical Past, not mystical past like on the poster. Sharing and unsharing narratives about Jews and Muslims' relationships in Morocco. So please help me welcome Professor Trevisan Semi.
Okay. So, first of all, I would like to say that it's so much a pleasure to be here, and I really thank you very, very, very much for this invitation. And I would like to thank all the organizers of this session, and also Linda Wynn, that was so kind and she organized so well my staying here. Do you hear? I have to speak. Because I have this one, but it's okay? No, it's not okay. So I need this one. Okay. Okay. So I would like to start recalling one question that I ask myself many times, hearing Jews from Morocco in Israel, recalling their past, a past that was recalled like a paradise, a sort of paradise lost, but not only the country, Morocco, but also people, also their neighbors, their friends, their Muslim friends. So my question was, do Morocco Muslims share the same nostalgia towards the Jews who left Morocco? And this was the start of my research in Morocco. And my research was about the relationships between the relationship in the daily life between Jews and Muslims, especially in Meknes, and after I will explain why Meknes, and also the perceptions that Muslims still have today, and about their collective memory of the past of the Jews. Morocco is a paradise for Jews in Israel. In fact, there is no mythical operation linked to the departure of Jews from Morocco, like, for instance, Ezra and Nehemiah operation, the departure of Jews from Iraq, or the magic carpet for the Yemenites, or the Operation Moses, Operation Solomon. So there is not such a representation of the migration of Jews from Morocco. And there are many narratives about their coming to Israel. Also, it's a group orientalized, and just to think that at the end of 19th century, Jews coming from Morocco were known as Maravim, as Westerners, not at all as Orientals, because Maghreb, Marav, it's the West. But in the 50s, they change, they shift, and they enter a new category, Edota Mizrach, Mizrahim, the Orientals. And they were stigmatized. In the 50s, they were known under Moroccan Sakin, the Moroccan with the knife. They were homogenized while they are a very composite society because there are big differences regarding Jews coming from the north of Morocco. They were the Spanish culture. They spoke Spanish, Judeo-Spanish, Aketia, the special language, and they consider themselves Europeans, Spanish Europeans, not at all Oriental people. Also, Jews coming from the port city like Mogador, today Essaouira, and also from Mogador, there were very well-off Jews who spoke English, or also Jews, very poor Jews coming from the Mela. So very composite. And we have to recall also Jews coming from the villages, from lost villages in the Atlas Mountains. So a very composite group, but today is known, they are known just as Moroccans. Which past is celebrated in Israel? In fact, in Israel, there are many places. There are in squares. You have parks. You have streets dedicated to the memory of kings of Morocco in Israel. So King Hassan II and Mohammed V. So Morocco is present in the Israeli space, public space. Also, the cult of the saints were very typical to Jews of Morocco and Maghreb in general. They were transplanted in Israel, so this also comes from Morocco. The celebration of Mimuna, that is a feast that now it's a national Israeli feast, but changed, and we will see after what was the meaning of Mimuna in Morocco. Anyhow, Mimuna is celebrated in Israel too. The Andalus Orchestra in the south of Israel, where most of Moroccans are located, and every weekend you can hear to this orchestra. And the road trips to Morocco, organized starting from the 80s, of Jews coming back to visit their houses, to visit cemeteries, and so on. Yes, the memory of the past is read in the light of the present. It's important to remember that sure there is the memory is transmitted through through the prism of the Israeli conflict, and this we can find it in Israel and in Morocco too. In Israel, for instance, the Muslim Moroccans are not considered as Arabs, but Moroccans, something different. They are not seen as Arabs. And in Israel, in Morocco, you may have different way of remembering Jews. You can find a sort of way of consider Jews like Israelis, so Jews of Morocco may be seen like Israeli in some sectors of the population, and we will see this later on. But also there is a memory of Jews with as if the conflict, Israeli-Palestine conflict, didn't exist. So you have both ways of remembering. And Halbachs, with his very important book on collective memory, has shown that the memory is nourished, is entertained by the social groups who carry it. So the places of memory are very important in order to entertain the past. How much of that past finds expression in the official narrative? Not very much in Israel, for instance, where just a few pages of the books tell about the history of the Jews of Morocco, nor in Morocco, where the official historians don't mention the Jewish Morocco legacy, especially after the 50s, but also before. But the memory is kept through individual memories. The past began to resurface. This is a novel of Sami Berdugo, The Advarim. These are the things, difficult to translate it. It's a new novel. Sami Berdugo is a second generation Jew from Morocco, and it's a very important novel because it represents a change, the end of the author censorship of Jews of Morocco in Israel, and a new way to show, to speak of their past. In this novel, we have just a son and her mother and his mother, and they are 1 week in their former house, and the son wants to teach the Hebrew alphabet to her mother. His mother said she's an alphabet, and the mother accepts only at the condition that the son will hear her story from Morocco, her true story, and also the story of Jews in Morocco. So, it's very special because the language of the mother is not Hebrew. It's a different language. It's the language of the immigrants, a sort of mixture of Hebrew without rules, and French and Judeo-Arabic. And it's, I think, a real challenge for future translators. Why McNess? The beginning of the research was in 2005. And first of all, there was a big amount of Jews until 48 in McNess. And McNess has the speciality to have 2 mellahs. Mellah is the Jewish quarter. In the 30s, when most of the Jews in Morocco left Mellah, in McNess, because it was a very traditional society, they decided to build a new one, a more modern but a new Mellah, and they built it just close out of the walls, but close to the old Mellah. And this permitted to have a cohabitation of Jews and Muslims in the old Mellah, because well-off Jews left the old one and rent their rooms, part of the house. They lived in the traditional Moroccan house with the courtyard in the middle. And so they share the same space. And there is memory of this. And my colleague, Hanan Skat Hatimi, who accepted to share the research with me, and she's from McNess. and she teaches Islamic law at the university in Fez, but she has a very special background because she studied Hebrew with a Jewish professor in Meknes, who then left Meknes for Paris, for the south of France. And she got a fellowship. She studied in Paris, in Alco, and after in Jerusalem. So I decided that she was the right person to do this kind of research with me. In the book that we published, we can show memory of a common socio-cultural habitus. Jews in Meknes shared really the same culture, and some special, for instance, the way of the jokes is very special to Meknes, and people in Meknes, they call themselves Meknesi, are very proud of this way of joke. And was a way for Jews. Jews also insulted Muslims, insulted friends, but it was allowed. It was allowed by this culture, and both of them insulted. And it was just a way, according to me, to reassess asymmetry of the conditions because of the relations of power. The hybridization of the Jewish-Muslim culture and society in Morocco, and the complexity, density, ambiguity of the relations between Jews and Muslims. In fact, not always share the same relationship, and we can find different sectors in the Muslim Morocco society that show different feelings towards the Jews. So it's really a very complex society. This is my colleague Hanan Skat-Khatimi. We are in the field work in the souk of Meknes. This is the book, the cover of the book. Meknes in 1947 and in 2005. In 1947, there were more than 15,000 Jews in Meknes, and in 2005, only 80 people. And in Morocco, in 1947, there were 270,000 Jews, and today between 3,000 and 5,000. And during the research was conducted through interviews. So we interviewed the Jews left, and Muslims of the different men and women, men in different sectors of society, in the souk, but also middle class, entrepreneur, teachers, intellectuals, and women also, the women of the bourgeoisie who had close relationships with friends, with Jewish friends, and they had a lot of memory about this, and also the maiden who worked in Jewish families. This is a place of, this is a square of Meknes, and behind the wall there is a Medina, and on the left starts the souk, the market, and just down on the left 10 minutes walk down, you can find the Mellach. So the Mellach was not was linked to the souk, to the market, was not far from the market, and Jews shared books, shared shops in the same space with Muslims. Places of Jewish memory. I recalled the importance of the places of Jewish memory also according to Halvax. And what we can find today is still the old, the new Mellach. They are very well in very well conditions. Houses of Jews in the old and the new Mellach that you can visit, and I will explain with the next slide. The road trips of Morocco Jews from abroad, Israel, France, Canada, pilgrimages to the tombs of the saints, one very important, not so far from Meknes, is to the tomb of Amran ben Diwan in Ouazzane. There are still synagogues, cemeteries, and food, and music, and a lot of memory. This is a house in the old Mellach, and this is the owner of the house, but the house was the house of the former rabbi, Berdugo, and I had the chance to visit this house with my colleague, Yolande Cohen, the granddaughter of the rabbi, and she recognized the house, so we tried to enter, and we were together, and this man was very kind, and he showed the house, and he was very proud that the house belonged to Jews, and he insisted that he didn't want to make any change because it was an historical house, and his son, for instance, explained us that he looked through internet in order to have more information about Jews because the house belonged to Jews. You can see the interior of the house, and from the tiny street in the Mella, you couldn't imagine such a beautiful house, but this a little bit like in Venice, so it's the same way. So I was not so surprised. And this is also one part of the house. And the owner showed us the act of the property in '68 from Berdugo. These are Israelis who are visiting Talmud Torah, the road trip I spoke about. And here also, and you can see in the middle, there are two Jews from Meknes. They say blessings to tourists, and they live with the money they receive. And you can see on the top the special lamps of memory that the family give to the synagogues or Talmud Torah in order to remember deceased members of the family. And here you have the door of the hammam that belong. Here is a new Mellach, as the hammam belonged to Jews, and after was sold to Muslims. But Jews left and Muslims share the same place. And here you have the pilgrimage to the tomb of the saint, and you can see on the tomb the wallets that people put in order, hoping that the saint will fill with money. The hope is the last to die. And you can see scarves. They put scarves when a vow is fulfilled on the tree. And here is the entrance of the old Mellach. Once there was a door that closed the ports of the Mellach. Jewish collective memory of the 60s and the 70s. This was a period of great change. And I interviewed not only Jews in Meknes, but I interviewed also Jews from Meknes in France and in Israel. So I collected many interviews, and they share feelings of fear. They remember a climate of fear a difficult environment in the 60s and 70s, a feeling of uncertainty about the future, uncertainty about individuals' role in the new, more Arabized and Islamized society of the 60s and the 70s. So it was difficult for them to find their place and to be sure that their rights will be guaranteed in the future. And a big wave of departures that was difficult to face. And even if families didn't know if they will leave or not, there was a common sense that they had to leave. There was nothing to do. The reasons for departures in the 40s and 70s and the 50s, the departures were especially because economical and nationalist reasons, influence of Messianic Zionism and of Mossad. In the 60s and 70s, less influence of Zionism and Mossad, while more information circulates on the difficult situation of Moroccan Jews in Israel. So Jews prefer to leave for France and Canada, not only for Israel. And in the same period, the elites began to emigrate to France and Canada because of the influence of French culture and the Alliance schools, and some for Israel. And communists and left-wing Jews stayed in Morocco. This is very important because in the interviews it was very common that people remember the name of Jews who were imprisoned, who shared the fate of Moroccan Muslims and who chose to stay in Morocco. And this was important for them in order to understand that they couldn't make Jews from Morocco the same as Israelis, so there was a difference, and they had to recognize this difference. The shared memory, there is shared memory of Jews and Muslims about food and traditional Jewish cuisine that was highly appreciated in Morocco society. For instance, the word kasher is still used in Morocco in order to ask chicken sausage. So it's you ask in shops kasher and you receive chicken sausage. Even the word chametz, they can use in order to say it's forbidden. They say it's chametz. It's was quite strange. But also they spoke of imbalance of food practices. So they know that Jews can't eat by Muslims, but Muslims may eat by Jews. And this was recalled. Mimuna was a very important feast in Morocco with a different meaning compared to what is the meaning in Israel, because the feast is at the last day of the week of Pesach, and Muslims and Jews exchanged food. So Muslims went to the Jews' houses, offering them food, milk, mint, fruits, and received back what was left from the week of Pesach. And it was a sort of very important from a social point of view, this this way to reciprocate and sharing. Knowledge of Hebrew prayers and practices among Muslims. It was quite astonishing to see how Muslims in the market, for instance, can remember and say blessing before the meals still today. And they remember because they were invited to the houses, so they learned how to say blessings. The market was a shared place, as I told. There is still one Jew left in the market, in a little shop. And the space of complicity. This was very important because people remember that they could go in the Mellach to buy mahia. Mahia is a special liqueur done by Jews. They still do it in Morocco today. You can buy it in the stores, but people say it's not the same. We are not able to do as Jews did. So there are still a few families in the new Mellach that are doing, and Muslims know where they can buy the true mahia. But also Jews went to smoke during Shabbat with the neighbors, the friends, the Muslim friends. So this gives the idea of the complexity of that society. But there are differences of memory in sectors of Moroccan society. There was a big difference among interviews in the souk and interviews of the middle class entrepreneur and students, because I didn't mention students, but we did interview with students of the university. They are Arabs and Berbers. There is a big amount of Berbers who study in Meknes University. And the interviewed in the souk have show feelings of really strong nostalgia for the time of the Jews. When there were the Jews, all was okay, the economy was fantastic, everything was good, and they remember Jews by their names. So Jews are not a category, not an abstract category, but they are Mimun, Musa, Jacob, and not the Jews. In the middle class, it was quite different, and they showed feelings of anti-Semitism, maybe because of the there are different explanations. I think the importance of the anti-Semitism of French colonialism and French colonialists. There were a big colony in Meknes of French colonies and colonialists, and also because of the competition, economic competition, social competition, so this could explain. And they were more influenced by the media, by the political Islam discourse, more than the inhabitants of the souk, because they, in the souk, people don't know Arabic. So they don't listen to television because they can't understand, because they speak Moroccan. This is a dialect very different from Arabic. So this was also a big difference, because the souk people were less influenced by. These are just a few people from the souk that we interviewed. You can see from the different kind of shops. And, but there are unshared memories also. The unshared memories concern especially the question of the migration of Jews, of the departures, and this is a fractured memory. The Muslims ask themselves why Jews left. They have no answer, or they don't want to have answers. But what is sure, they didn't expect that Jews left. And it was very interesting because in Meknes in 1967 there was a murder in the New Mellach. Two young Jews were murdered, and everybody in the Jewish community remember this, not only in Meknes, but also people interviewed in Paris, in Israel. So Jews from Meknes remember still today what happened, but not the Muslim. Just one interview remember this event. We found negation of feelings of fear, no empathy with what Jews felt in the 67 and in 73 too. and they accused Zionists. So why the Jews left? Because of Zionists and because of children and women. This means that in the public discourse, according to the Muslim interviews, Jews didn't want to leave Morocco. They were obliged by children and by women. A sort of feminization of the immigration, a way to consider less men, these men that didn't react, didn't. So we can find, I speak of a double trauma, a trauma for Jews who left and Jews who stayed, because also Jews who stayed remember how families, large families were dispersed through the world. What is important according to me is that it still is missing in Moroccan society the mourning for the disappearance of an historical component of Moroccan society. And it is interesting that in 2007, 2 films were done by Moroccans, Adieu le Maire and Uva Timoshi, and both films talk about the migration of Jews in a very interesting way. So recognize also the climate of fear and all the little disturbances that the Jews had. So to conclude, the question I asked myself at the beginning, do Muslims feel the same feelings of nostalgia? I can answer with in different ways. So it depends on the sectors of the Muslim society. There are big differences, as I told you before, if it concerns the Jews, the Muslims in the market, the souk inhabitants, that really feel the same feelings of nostalgia, and they asked me, do you think Jews could come back to Morocco? And they were enthusiastic to the idea that the Jews could come back to Morocco. On the contrary, among the entrepreneur milieu and also teachers, but not intellectuals. As I told before, feelings of anti-Semitism were very strong. So the common way of representing, according to anti-Semite way. And students, there is a big difference, Berber students and Arab students. Arab students share the same feelings of anti-Semitism, and sure they read, they consider the Jews through the prism of the conflict, so they can't make differences between the Jews of Morocco and the Jews in Israel and Israelis. On the opposite, the Berbers have a lot of memories. This is because the Berber society is an oral society, so it's easier to entertain memories, but also there was transmission in the Berber families, and they share the same feelings as I found among the souk inhabitants. So there is just not just one answer, but many answers, and thank you.
Well, I have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Maurice Samuel. He's a professor of French at Yale University, and he has published many articles and book chapters, which I will not quote because the list is too long. Those articles deal with the different interests of Professor Samuels, among which 19th and 20th century French literature, French culture and history, visual culture, cinema, Jewish studies, and literary theory. And I think that currently he's working on anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism in France. His first book, Popular History and the Novel in 19th Century France, received the Yale University Gadish Smith International Book Prize. His second book, published by Stanford University Press in 2010, entitled Inventing the Israelite Jewish Fiction in 19th Century France. This second book won the Modern Literature Association Scaglione Prize, which is given every year for an outstanding book in the literary and linguistic field. I was happy enough to be in the committee. We decided to award the prize. To be short, I will just read the citation the committee sent to the Modern Language Association for the prize. Here is the citation. Maurice Samuels, Inventing the Israelite Jewish Fiction in 19th Century France, breaks important ground in our understanding of French Jewish culture before the Dreyfus affair and the modern turn. Mining a largely forgotten body of text, Samuels shows how fictional narratives allowed French Jewish writers of the mid-19th century to experiment with new identities in a situation marked by strong post-revolutionary pressure to acculturate and assimilate. Samuel's book shed new light on issues and debates that are highly relevant today, especially in France: French identity and ethnic particularism, religion and laïcité, French citizenship and cultural assimilation. By showing that these now forgotten 19th century Jewish authors were in fact the French ethnic writers, Samuels invites us to rethink the place of ethnic literary production in the construction of a French literary canon. The result is an impressive, brilliant, and captivating work. So I will ask Professor Samuels to talk today about fictions of Jewish identity in 19th century French, and please let's welcome him together.
So thank you. Can everyone hear me with this? Okay. So thank you, Elisabeth, and thank you for giving me the prize for that. So thank you, and thank you to the organizers of this very interesting series of conferences. So we're going to be moving back in time now. I'm going to be talking about an earlier period, the mid-19th century in France, and how the first generation of Jews born as French citizens negotiated questions of identity in fiction. So I'm not going to be talking about the North African question or the relationship of Jews and Muslims, of those communities today, but I will be suggesting that the literature written by 19th century French Jews is relevant for understanding contemporary issues of identity in France. So that's going to be my kind of gambit here today. I want to begin by advancing the thesis that 19th century French Jews created the first minority or ethnic fiction in French. To my knowledge, they were the first members of a minority ethnic group in France to use fiction as a way to reconcile their universal identity as French citizens with their particular identity as members of a religious and ethnic group with its own traditions, language, and culture. I want to argue that the record of their struggle, preserved in novels and short stories, offers insights into key questions about identity formation in modern French society. Now, this is not to suggest that 19th century French Jews represent a model minority or an example that others should follow. I don't want to argue that the choices they made were necessarily the right ones, or that what seemed to work in 1850 in very different historical circumstances still holds for minorities today. But I do think that 19th century Jews confronted certain dilemmas, including the problem of how to reconcile their particular religious and cultural affiliation with the demands of French universalism in a paradigmatic way, and that the answers they formulated offer an important historical grounding for current debates. This is an argument that I gesture to in my recent book, Inventing the Israelite, Jewish Fiction in 19th Century France, which was published by Stanford in 2010. But I'd like to make the case more concretely here with you today. So first, a little bit of historical background on the Jews in France. So bear with me here. I know that some of you probably might know this, but some of you might not. So bear with me for a couple pages here. During the Middle Ages, France had been a center of Jewish life, with several important communities, including in the Rhineland and in Provence. Jews were expelled periodically during the period of the Middle Ages. So kings often kicked them out, confiscated their property, and then invited them back a few years later. But they were expelled definitively in 1394 and technically not allowed to reside in France until the Revolution of 1789. There were, however, some exceptions. In order to promote trade, the crown allowed several thousand Sephardic Jews who had fled the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal to settle in southwestern France, in and around Bordeaux, beginning in the 16th century. They had to pretend to be Christian until 1723, when they were finally given permission to live openly as Jews. So there were at the time of the Revolution, there were about 5,000 Jews in and around Bordeaux. A larger community of roughly 30,000 Ashkenazic Jews lived in the eastern provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which France gained after the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century. The Papal States in and around Avignon in the south, which didn't become part of France until 1791, were home to several thousand more Jews who lived in ghettos called carrières into the 18th century. So they were locked up in neighborhoods in 4 towns, basically, in Provence until the 18th century. Additionally, a community of 500 to 800 Jews lived in Paris, where they were technically not allowed before the Revolution. And most of these clandestine Parisian Jews originated from the 3 other poles of French Jewish settlement, so from the southwest, from the east, and from the south. By the time of the Revolution, the Sephardic Jews of southwestern France had achieved a certain amount of integration into French society, although they retained a distinct Jewish identity. They spoke French, as well as Judeo-Spanish, Ladino. They owned land and participated actively in the economic and political life of the region. The same was not really true for the Ashkenazic Jews in Alsace and Lorraine. These Jews more closely resembled their co-religionists in Eastern Europe. Forbidden from inhabiting most large towns or cities and prevented from engaging in most trades and professions, they lived dispersed in small rural villages, spoke Western Yiddish, and eked out meager livings in petty trade, especially peddling, horse trading, and money lending. Largely despised by their Christian neighbors, they retained a high degree of communal autonomy with their own legal and governance structures. So whereas the Sephardim of Bordeaux were generally open to Enlightenment ideas, the Ashkenazim of Alsace and Lorraine remained by and large bound to orthodoxy, practicing traditional rabbinic Judaism. There were some exceptions to this, mainly among the Jews of Metz, which was one of the main cities in eastern France, where there were some maskilim, which is the word for Jewish Enlightenment reformers. So, the revolution radically altered the fate of all of France's Jews, and for the first time cast their lots together. Despite their tiny numbers, 0.14 28 million at the time of the revolution, the Jews attracted, so around 40,000 total, I would say. So despite their tiny numbers, the Jews attracted a surprising amount of attention from the revolutionaries, who debated their status on more than 30 occasions between 1789 and 1791, despite more pressing concerns, including famine and war. The Revolutionary Constituent Assembly eventually granted full civil rights to male Jews in two separate decrees. First, the Sephardic Jews of the Southwest became citizens in January of 1790, and then the mass of Ashkenazic Jews followed in September of 1791. This revolutionary gesture marks the first time that a modern nation had specifically and deliberately emancipated the Jews, removing almost all obstacles to their civil equality. And I say almost all because there were a few tiny exceptions to this, including the more Judaico. So Jews had to swear a special oath to testify in court. And there was a lawsuit about that the big leader of the Jewish, this guy who would soon become the leader of the Jewish community, Adolphe Crémieux, managed to get removed, that thrown out, that one last requirement in I think, the 1840s. Now, Napoleon's record on Jewish rights was mixed. Abroad, he spread emancipation to the Jews of the many lands he conquered. At home, however, he enacted a series of decrees that discriminated against Jews, thus in part reneging on the revolution's promise of equality before the laws. And this was in 1808. He passed these laws that only applied to the Jews of Alsace, and that said that Christians who had contracted debts to Jews did not have to repay them unless the Jews could show certain documents that were almost impossible to show. So it was a law that specifically discriminated against Jews and went contrary to the revolution's principle of equality before the law. Also, Jews were the only group that could not buy replacements for army service. And that was part of Napoleon's effort to force the Jews to socially integrate by forcing them into the army. Napoleon also reorganized the French Jewish community by creating the consistory as an umbrella organization responsible for all aspects of the religion and brought it under control of the state. The regimes that followed him in the 19th century, so after Napoleon's fall, we have the Restoration from 1815 to 1830, the July Monarchy from 1830 to 1848, the Second Republic from 1848 to 1852, the Second Empire from 1852 to 1852 to 1870, and then the Third Republic. Each brought the Jews closer to civil and social equality with other French men and women. Freed from the struggle over emancipation that occupied Jews in other European countries, and from the restrictions excluding them from schools and professions, individual French Jews achieved unparalleled success in the 19th century. As in other countries, like in the German states and Austria, Jews particularly excelled in business and the arts. Only in France, however, did unconverted Jews reach the highest levels of government beginning in the 1830s. In the 1840s, 3 Jews were elected to the Chamber of Deputies. Following the Revolution of 1848, Jews occupied 2 out of 8 ministerial positions in the provisional government and continued to hold high ministerial posts during the Second Empire. Jewish participation in government would accelerate under the Third Republic, so from 1870 to 1940, despite an increase in anti-Semitism during that period. And unlike in most other European countries, the French army promoted Jews to officer ranks from very early in the 19th century. The fact that the Dreyfus affair took place in France can be traced not only to the residual anti-Semitism of the French army, but also to that institution's democratic openness, for Dreyfus had achieved the rank of captain despite practicing Judaism. But while individual Jews achieved remarkable success in a variety of fields in the 19th century, a large percentage of France's Jews remained quite poor and only partly acculturated. This is true for many of those Jews who stayed behind in rural villages in Alsace and Lorraine, as well as for the constantly increasing numbers of Jews who moved to large towns and cities. Throughout the century, however, increasing numbers of Jews throughout France began to adopt bourgeois occupations and comportments. This transformation can be traced through the disappearance of the figure of the Jewish peddler, the sign of Jewish economic and social backwardness, and a figure of opprobrium, both for anti-Semites and for acculturating Jews. So the historian, my former colleague, who unfortunately recently passed away, Paula Hyman, traced the decline of the number of Jewish peddlers throughout the 19th century, and it goes precipitously down until the very end of the 19th century with the influx of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, which changes the face of the Jewish community. So I'm talking, though, about before that, when the Jewish community was relatively more homogenous. As the Jews joined the bourgeoisie, they shed many of the trappings of traditional Jewish life, including the use of Yiddish, and often ceased to attend synagogue as well. However, while numerous voices among both the reformers and the Orthodox complained about the rising tide of religious indifference in the Jewish community, relatively few French Jews chose to convert in the 19th century, perhaps because they had little to gain from it. Unlike in the German states and Austria, where conversion was necessary to enter the university, to join the liberal professions, that was not the case in France, and that probably explains why there were so few conversions. Historians have also estimated that intermarriage rates in France were likewise comparatively low, with acculturated Jews often marrying other acculturated Jews in the 19th century. This, I think, suggests that communal affiliation and ethnic identity outlasted religious practice. France's Jewish population grew rapidly throughout the first half of the 19th century. There were roughly 70, so if there were about 40,000 at the time of the Revolution of 1789, there were 70 to 80,000 out of a total French population of 33 million in 1840. By 1861, this number had risen to 95,881, only to fall by 45% following the loss of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany in 1870. Paris saw the most significant growth in its Jewish population throughout the 19th century, drawing migrants mainly from Alsace and Lorraine, but also from other parts of France and also from Germany, and then especially later from Eastern Europe. By 1880, there were 40,000 Jews in Paris alone. The main trend in assessing this history for a long time was to argue that 19th century French Jews wanted nothing more than to assimilate into French society. Despite their low conversion rates, historians have tended to assume, or did for a long time, that French Jews could not wait to shed their particular identity as Jews in order to become French citizens. Writing in the aftermath of the Nazi genocide, Hannah Arendt devotes a large portion of her section on anti-Semitism in The Origins of Totalitarianism to the French case, and specifically to the French Jews' inability to meet the challenge of the Dreyfus affair. I quote, "When the Dreyfus affair broke out to warn them that their security was menaced, they were deep in the process of a disintegrating assimilation," end of quote. So according to Arendt, French Jews at the time of the Dreyfus affair refused to speak out against anti-Semitism for fear of jeopardizing their own social integration. This, I think, is a serious charge. for it paints a picture of a deluded community or lack of community that failed to act in politically responsible ways. The legacy of this 19th century assimilation, Arendt implies, led the French Jews into the snare of Auschwitz. But even if we avoid what I think is the error of viewing the 19th century through the lens of 20th century catastrophe, Arendt's critique raises serious questions. Were 19th century French Jews really so eager to shed their Jewish identity? Did their embrace of French citizenship blind them to the menacing realities that they faced and inhibit communal solidarity? Did their desire to become French preclude their remaining Jews? Or have our own ideologies, our own assumptions about the nature of assimilation or about the nature of French universalism blinded us to the historical reality of the French Jewish experience? Recently, historians have begun to complicate this picture of the assimilating tendencies of the so-called Franco-Judaism of the 19th century. Stanford's own Aaron Rodrigue, who's here today, has written about the formation of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the first major Jewish international aid organization, which was founded in Paris in 1860. Why was it that these Jews, who were supposedly so intent on assimilating at all costs into French society, would have founded an organization with the aim of promoting solidarity among Jews worldwide? And this at the historical moment in which faith in the assimilating project was at its highest level, decades before the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the fin de siècle period. Perhaps what we thought we knew about Franco-Judaism was not completely true. Perhaps 19th century French Jews were not quite as intent on full assimilation as we thought. When I set out to write my book, my hunch was that the fiction produced by this community would shed light on that question. What kinds of stories, I wondered, did French Jews tell about their situation in the century after the Revolution of 1789, when France became the first modern country to emancipate the Jews? How did 19th century French Jews imagine their place in the nation and the world? How did they conceive of their past and their future? How did they view their relation to other Jews? But first I faced a more basic question. Did this fiction exist? Now, most scholars said that it did not. In fact, the textbook that I still use when I teach courses on Jewish identity and French culture contains a chapter on French Jewish literature and maintains that it only came into existence at the beginning of the 20th century in response to the Dreyfus Affair. According to this text, written by a Jew, 19th century French Jews were too concerned with their social and economic advancement to write. And yet, while researching my first book, which had been my dissertation, on historical representation in 19th century France, I had come across, when I was doing this research, a historical novel entitled La Juive, so the Jewess, published in 1835 by a Jewish woman from Bordeaux named Eugénie Foat. Written in the historical style of Walter Scott, this melodramatic page-turner set in 18th century Paris tells the story of a Jewish woman who falls in love with a Christian nobleman and dies as a result of her illicit passion. When I started to become interested in so I should say that, it's one of these things when you're doing research for one project and you come across something that is really interesting but doesn't really fit, bear on what you're working on then, you don't really know what to do. So at the time, I did a little bit of research on her. I found out that she was Jewish. I found out that she wrote other books, but I wasn't working on Jews at that point, so I sort of filed it away. So when I started to become interested in the question of Jewish literature a few years later, I went back to Foat and discovered that she wrote a series of novels and stories about Jews and Judaism beginning in 1830. These works fascinated me because of the way they used the popular generic forms of the day, including those of both the historical and sentimental novel, to confront the central problem of Jewish modernity, or the central problems of Jewish modernity, including intermarriage, conversion, and the conflict between personal freedom and Jewish tradition. Here, it seemed, lay evidence that a French Jew of the early to mid-19th century had in fact made an attempt at writing fiction. But did she represent a lone case? Now, I knew from other reading that a few popular writers of the 19th century, of this period, such as Léon Gozlan, which probably might mean something to some of you who study 19th century. He was a very good friend of Balzac. I knew that he and a few others were Jewish. But to my knowledge, Gozlan didn't write about Jews, so his work, while potentially interesting as a sign of a certain kind of literary assimilation, did not have much to tell me about the French Jewish experience. So I kind of ruled him out. My big break came when I began to read the new French Jewish press of the period, especially the two major monthly Jewish newspapers founded in the early 1840s, Les Archives Israélites and L'Univers Israélite. These journals, which continued to thrive until World War II, published a great deal of writing in many genres, including fiction, and all of this fiction depicted Jews. These journals also published reviews of other books, including much fiction that I was able to locate at the National Library in Paris, and this finally convinced me that Foa had in fact inaugurated a trend. So let me now give you a sense of the writers I discuss in my book and how they wrestled with the problem of French Jewish identity. Chapter 1 presents the novels and short stories of Eugénie Foa. Her maiden name was Rodrigue Enriquez, and she was the woman, I believe, was the first Jew to write fiction in French, and one of the first modern Jewish women to write fiction in any language. I think there might have been one German one who beat her to it, but she was really one of the first. She was born to one of the most prominent Sephardic families in Bordeaux, and her dates were 1796 to 1853. She combined two popular literary genres of the day, the Walter Scott-inspired historical novel and the sentimental novel, or more specifically what Stanford's Margaret Cohen has called the sentimental social novel. Foa recast these popular generic forms in Jewish terms, using their conventions to frame issues of central importance to the Jewish community, and particularly to her elite milieu, including the clash between individual freedom and traditional authority. Her first novel was entitled Le Kiddushim, and it was published in 1830. And I would point out how very strange it was to have a novel in French with a Hebrew title in 1830. It really sort of stands out. Indeed, advertisements in the popular press of the day billed it as a novel translated from the Hebrew, even though it was not. It was written in French, in order, I think, to play up its exotic content. And that clearly, I think, was something that Foa herself was complicit with that marketing strategy. The novel centers on the romantic dilemma of a young Jewish man named Kezil. And I should also point out that she picked the most kind of exotic names for all her Jewish characters, totally unlike the names of actual Jews in France, including her own family. So you have this young Jewish man named Kezil who must choose between two marriage partners, both cousins of his. One of these women he actually loves, and the other one he has been manipulated into proposing to by her scheming and very evil mother. As Foa explains, according to the Jewish law of the Kiddushim, or betrothal, once a proposal has been made, it cannot be broken. So she manipulates him into proposing to her daughter, even though he doesn't love her. So the melodramatic ending to this several hundred-page novel has the cousin he's engaged to, so the daughter of the evil woman, try to murder the cousin he loves by throwing her off the Pont Neuf. Fortunately for Kézil, after both women fall into the Seine, so they struggle on the bridge and they both wind up falling over, the evil cousin drowns while the good cousin is pulled to safety, leaving him free to marry the woman he loves without violating Jewish tradition. So he doesn't break the rule, but he's still able to marry the woman he loves. I should actually back up by saying that he was actually about to marry the woman he didn't love, and he fainted during the wedding ceremony, which got him out of it and delayed it. Here, Fouad takes the classic structure of the sentimental social novel, including what Margaret Cohen refers to as the clash of conflicting duties, the struggle between two opposing moral viewpoints. So fidelity to Jewish tradition and this kind of arcane law, and his heart. And she uses it to test the limits of individualism within the Jewish tradition. If this early work gestures towards individual freedom while still resolving in favor of tradition, Fouad's later novels would be more willing to challenge Jewish authority. Notably, in these later works, the protagonist is a woman, allowing Fouad to cast a critical eye on gender norms within the Jewish tradition as well, showing how Jewish women are doubly subjugated. And Fouad herself was a lifelong advocate for women's causes. I should say that she herself was the victim of a bad marriage contracted within the Jewish tradition. So her husband abandoned her, which was really bad to have happen in the 19th century because divorce was illegal. So it was legal within the Jewish tradition, but not in France after 1816. And bourgeois women abandoned by their husbands were really in trouble because there was very little they could do. And she turned to writing to get out of this predicament, to kind of support her family. She had 2 children. So in novels such as La Juive, the Jewess of 1835, and Bilette, or the daughter of the Jew Jonatas from 1845, Fouad's feisty heroines struggle between loyalty to their traditionalist fathers and desire to marry outside the faith. In the cases of both of those novels, the daughters choose love over loyalty. Bilette even goes so far as to convert to Christianity, mirroring Fouad's own conversion in the 1840s. She was the only one of the writers who I talk about who converted to Catholicism. Neither of these novels has a happy ending, however. The heroine of the Jewess dies a lonely death after being shunned by her parents, and Bilette is left on the altar by her Christian suitor, who it turns out just wanted her for her family's money. Her conversion was not wasted, however, for she eventually finds solace in the convent. As I show, Fouad's fictions are in many ways rewritings of the novels of Walter Scott, or specifically of Ivanhoe of 1818. But whereas the Jewish heroine of Ivanhoe, Rebecca, chooses to remain Jewish rather than marry the Christian knight she loves, Fouad comes closer to advocating extreme forms of Jewish assimilation, including conversion. And yet, even while her fictions sanction conversion and intermarriage as solutions to the problem of Jewish particularity, her own literary example exploits Jewish difference to carve out an identity in the crowded literary marketplace of July monarchy France. Paradoxically, although Fouad herself converted and used fiction to reject many aspects of Jewish tradition, she did more than any of the writers I examine to invent the category of the Jewish writer in France. Now, Ben Levi, who's the subject of chapter 2, that's a pseudonym for Godcho Baruch Vey, and his dates are 1806 to 1878. He hailed from a family of wealthy Parisian Jews of Alsatian origin. And as I discovered, this was a thrilling discovery for a French literature professor, he was the great-uncle of Proust, of Marcel Proust. And this is a literary association that I'll examine at the end of my talk today. He was the half-brother of Proust's maternal grandfather. He was the author of a dozen short stories published published in the Archives Israélite in the 1840s. And he used the new literary codes that critics at the time were beginning to label realist in order to make the case for religious reform. Witty, urbane, and politically engaged, he, like Fouad, confronted the dilemmas faced by the assimilating French-Jewish bourgeoisie. Unlike Fouad, however, he sought to invent a new form of Judaism that even acculturated French Israelites could embrace, while chiding them for abandoning elements of tradition. He also displayed a deep concern for Jewish solidarity across class and national boundaries. And I think it's in his writings that we see some of the ideological groundwork for the Alliance that would take shape later. In one story from 1840, he traces the fate of a tallis, or prayer shawl, as it gets passed down through 3 generations of a Parisian Jewish family. The grandfather, a used iron dealer and devoutly Orthodox old regime Jew, imports the shawl from Poland for his wedding. So this is before the revolution. His son, a soldier in Napoleon's army, carries the shawl into battle as a good luck charm and continues to venerate it even as he makes his way up the social ladder. His son, a fop and a dandy, has no use for the shawl whatsoever. At the end of the story, it winds up on the shoulders of his girlfriend, a courtesan, who uses it as part of her stevedore costume at the opera ball. An allegory for the decline of the Jewish religious and cultural tradition in modern France, this story indicts modern materialism and excessive individualism as much as any specifically Jewish drive to assimilate. In other stories, however, Ben Levi shows how the losses of modernity can be recuperated by the Jewish tradition. In a story called The Fish and the Breadcrumbs of 1846, another foppish Jewish gentleman prefers to go boating on Rosh Hashanah rather than pray. But even when he sees a young widow on the riverbank performing the traditional Jewish custom of tashlich, so throwing bits of bread into the water to cleanse herself of sin, he realizes the power of Jewish ritual to comfort the sorrows of the human condition. This confirmed skeptic, the boater, becomes a believer, even if the exact content of his belief may represent a significant departure from Jewish tradition. Ben Levi's rival at the Orthodox L'Univers Israélite. So the Archive was more reformist. That's the one. That's the newspaper that was started in 1840, and then the Orthodox rival to it starts in 1844, and that had been this rival writer who wrote under the name Ben Baruch. So there were the 2 Bens here. Ben Baruch was the pseudonym of Alexandre Créange, and his dates were 1791 to 1872. He's the focus of my chapter 3. Born into a much more modest family in Lorraine, his father was a cantor. Ben Baruch appointed himself the champion of the capital's poor Orthodox workers and put his fiction in service of their struggle against the power structures of the French Jewish community, including the consistory and the elite reformers of the Archives Israélite, such as Ben Levi. So reform was much more closely identified with the wealthy elite Jews, and the poor Orthodox workers were opposed to them. Ben Baruch's itinerary as a writer represents a struggle to find the right literary form to express his populist and traditionalist vision of Judaism, shifting from Enlightenment satire to a unique mix of melodrama and Talmudic parable that he published in his own popular almanac. In one story that was actually published in the newspaper in L'Univers, he rewrites Montesquieu's Persian letters. A Moroccan rabbi visiting Paris writes home about all the customs of the Parisian Jewish community, lamenting the way the freest Jewish community in the world has become a slave to worldly success, abandoning tradition and communal solidarity in the process. Despite his call to uphold tradition, however, Ben Baruch's brand of orthodoxy reveals itself as no less modern than Ben Levi's reformist vision. So this is not quite orthodoxy, it's neo-orthodoxy. Alexandre Weil, and his dates are 1811 to 1899, the subject of chapter 4, and perhaps the most famous of the writers I talk about at the time, followed his own unique path, rejecting both orthodoxy and reform. Raised in a highly observant family in a small Alsatian village, he turned his back on his early training as a Talmudist to pursue a career in journalism in Paris. Vacillating between extreme left and extreme right-wing politics, he eventually returned to Judaism in the 1850s during the Second Empire in order to transform it from within. His tales of life in France's eastern provinces dramatize the conflicts faced by poor, semi-rural Jews in their confrontation with modernity, and advocate an anti-Talmudic brand of Judaism as a solution to Jewish as well as French political and social dilemmas. In his novel Couronne of 1857, another feisty Jewish woman rejects the materialist mindset of her parents in this small town in order to marry a poor Jewish schoolteacher with revolutionary ideals. Eventually, her idealism triumphs over her surroundings. The end of the novel has the girl's mother decide to join her daughter and her husband in colonial Algeria, even if it means abandoning the comforts of home and the pieties of Talmudic Judaism. And this, oddly, was a novel that went through multiple editions, so suggesting that it was actually read not just by Jews in the 19th century. In another story entitled Brandel of 1860, yet another feisty Jewish heroine fights to keep her fiancé from abandoning his dream of becoming a rabbi in order to become a horse trader and make money. Here, despite Weil's dislike of the Talmudic rabbinic tradition, the traditional Jewish elevation of religious study over worldly success becomes the seed of a revolutionary spirit. At the end of the story, Brandel, the woman, is killed in a riding accident, but Joël, her fiancé, remains true to her memory by devoting his life to study. A tireless firebrand and political agitator, Weil had no reticence about advocating for Judaism in the public sphere, so contradicting what Arendt would say, or about criticizing his fellow Jews in public, but believed in the universality of his vision of Jewish religious values. So he really believed that the seeds of the French revolutionary tradition can be found in what he called Mosaic monotheism, so in the Old Testament. He believed that Moses was the first French revolutionary. And it's really an attempt, I think, to create a Jewish universalism as opposed to a French universalism that I think he and other people in the Jewish community felt was too tinged by Christianity. The final chapter of my book explores a series of texts published in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s that look to the past as a model for the Jewish future. The fictionalized narratives of Daniel Stauben, that's a pseudonym for Auguste Vidal, and his dates are 1822 to 1875, first published also in the Archive and later in volume form as Scenes of Jewish Life in Alsace, describe journeys from Paris to his native village in eastern France, where traditional Jewish life was already felt to be on the verge of disappearance in the 1840s. These texts, so it was a group of kind of scenes that get united into a volume form. These texts invent a new form of Jewish nostalgia, which would become a dominant mode in Jewish belles letters, most famously, I think, in the stories of Sholem Aleichem in the late 19th century and the musical Fiddler on the Roof in the 20th. This is sort of the precursor to Fiddler on the Roof. In an analogous manner, the historical fictions of David Schornstein, and his dates are 1826 to 1879, use memory as a binding force for a community whose traditional center no longer holds. In a series of very violent texts set during the Middle Ages, Schornstein focuses on all the horrible persecutions Jews experienced in Christian Europe. In this chapter, I argue that these texts use past suffering as a way of cementing Jewish loyalty in the present, and in the process advance literature itself, and especially fiction, as the sacred text of this distinctly modern form of Judaism. And I think we have there a precursor of a lot of Holocaust fiction today, and this idea that a kind of obsession, you could say, with the Holocaust becomes a kind of replacement for Jewish religious identity for a lot of secular Jews. He was doing the same thing, but looking at pogroms and persecution in the Middle Ages. Taken together, these works show that 19th century French Jews did not merely rush to assimilate, to trade their particular identity as Jews for a new universal identity as French citizens. On the contrary, they imagined different ways of remaining Jewish while becoming French, using fiction as a kind of laboratory for experimenting with the different possibilities offered by their new historical situation. Some of the writers I discuss, like Foa, did seek a radical kind of assimilation, although even she, as I said, carved out her own form of identity as France's first Jewish writer. The others all sought to transform the meaning of Jewish identity and the meaning of the Jewish religion itself in order to take on a new kind of identity, one that was fully French as well as Jewish. And this Jewish identity was not confined exclusively to the private sphere, as the very existence, I think, of this literature shows. Publication is by definition public, and the thriving Jewish literary sphere I uncovered testifies to the ability of 19th century French Jews to invent alternate forms of Jewish life to replace those that they had abandoned during the Revolution. So, the French Jews had to give up their communal and legal structures. And I think in a way this literary sphere, and including the journalistic sphere, was a replacement for that. I should point out that not a single writer I encountered wished to reject the offer of French citizenship. All of them display intense gratitude to France for granting them civil rights, and all of them demonstrate this loyalty in explicit ways. Some even called for changing the Jewish liturgy to remove all traces of Jewish nationalism, so that we should get rid of next year in Jerusalem. This loyalty to France also manifests itself, and I should say that Ben Baruch, who was the Orthodox writer, was the one who translated a lot of the Jewish liturgy actually into French. So this loyalty to France also manifests itself as a loyalty to the French language, which they inhabit with pride and ease, confining any traces of traditional Jewish languages, of Yiddish or Hebrew, to the margins of texts, and always translating words into French whenever they arise, including words that you would expect that even very assimilated Jewish readers would know, like kasher. That is usually translated if it's used. Arendt and her ilk, then, were, I think, wrong to view the 19th century through the lens of a later period, in which the experience of renewed discrimination during the Dreyfus Affair and later Vichy caused French Jews to become more circumspect about expressing their Jewishness in public. One of the main arguments of my book is that the mid-19th century offered many more possibilities than we have previously imagined for thinking through the problems of minority identity and for attempting to make the French universalist system flexible enough to accommodate persistent particularisms. By way of conclusion, I'd like to return, as I promised, to Marcel Proust, who I think in many ways inherits the legacy of these 19th century Jewish writers. And I mean inherit in part literally because, as I mentioned before, he was the great-nephew of Ben Levi. Like his forebears, Proust uses fiction to probe the problem of Jewish identity in France. His epic novel, and I should say this is the argument of the conclusion of my book, his epic novel traces the itineraries of a number of different kinds of Jews in order to experiment with different possibilities for Jewish identity in modern France. Through the characters of Swann and Bloch especially, he shows two radically opposed paths. Swan is a cultured aesthete who moves from total assimilation to an extreme form of solidarity with his fellow Jews during the Dreyfus Affair. Bloch is an uncouth parvenu who attempts a comic kind of assimilation that cannot help but fail. He changes his name to the aristocratic-sounding Jacques du Rosier, and as many critics have pointed out, that kind of echoes the Rue des Rosiers, which is the most Jewish street in Paris. So he cannot escape his Jewishness, and Proust has a lot of fun with that. Like his uncle, then, Proust attempts to formulate a Jewish response to the so-called Jewish question, even if the answers he offers are less positive and contain less of a tie to actual Jewish culture than Ben Levy's. But with its French form and its Jewish, very largely Jewish content, Proust's novel provides a kind of fusion of Jewishness and Frenchness that eludes his own characters. It transforms the problem of Jewish identity into art. And I'll stop there.
Today is the 70th anniversary of the release of Casablanca, the film Casablanca, and I'm wondering if you may have found any memories in the Moroccan communities of the World War II period, and specifically life as a non-European in Morocco when it was a colony of Vichy.
If there is memory of the Vichy laws in Morocco? Not exactly?
That's okay. Yeah.
Because there is a lot of memory about the way the king acted. So both Jews and Muslims share the same idea that the king tried to save the Jews, and they are very and they recognize and they are very devoted to the king, because even if historians don't agree, it's more complex. So he tried to help Jews, but at the end he followed the Vichy laws, but he tried to do something. But in the common popular discourse, there is this idea that the king of Morocco tried to save Jews, if I understood the question. Yes, the fear can be explained by occasional insults. For instance, Jews were insulted by Muslims. Shops were damaged in the market, not only in Meknes, in all Morocco. So there were acts against the property of Jews, even if the event of the murder was just it happened in Meknes, and but this fear was a general fear because there were cases of not only insult, of harassing Jews also. Even if the king made public discourse in the asking Muslims not to disturb Jews because Jews were part of Morocco society. So the king tried to calm the mobs against Jews, but it happened. So the fear was a justified fear.
Can I do a follow-up on this question? There were this idea that up until then, Jews have been living in complete peace in Morocco among their Muslim friends as well. You said that, someone said that's quite mythical. I mean, there have been pogroms throughout the ages, and from time to time there were violent attacks against Jews districts. So what I mean is that violence has always been there, even though it didn't occur on a daily basis. But why suddenly a feeling of fear that compelled everyone to leave? Is it just because an alternative was there, which was disturbed, and they didn't have that alternative before, or was it something else?
Yeah, the fear was also because they couldn't, there was the uncertainty about the future. So because the Morocco society was changing and there was a more nationalist discourse and world became more Islamized and Arabized. The Arabic became the language. So they were they fear about their future. They couldn't see then they were not sure to have a place in the future Morocco society. So this also was part of the created this climate of uncertainty and fear and uncertainty, both. And there were episodes. So also this murder, during this, the murder was in July, and 2 months after the murder, 7,000 Jews left Morocco. So it means something. Yeah, sure. It was linked. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And what about, if I can just follow up, could you compare the situation of the Moroccan Jews leaving to the Algerian, to Egyptian, Tunisian? It seems like that in some of those other contexts they were, earlier and more directly forced out. And so have you looked at it in a comparative context at all to see whether the memory is different in, for instance, in Egypt where they,
I didn't research in Egypt, but I can imagine. Also, I remember from Karais, for instance, but Karais was a different case. But in Egypt, Jews left after 56. There was a mass exodus, and also in 67. So it was similar to the same way as in Morocco, but more mass immigration. In Morocco, there were some moments of mass immigration, and in 48, just after, and when there was more uncertainty, when the king died, Mohammed V died, also people, again, the fear, but what will happen? Because the king was the symbol of the protection of Jews, and when all the kings went out of Morocco, was exiled, or after when he died, again there was these feelings. But a difference we can see with Algeria, for instance, because in Algeria Jews were so Francisized.
they were French citizens.
He was French citizens, sure, and also linked to the French culture. So they consider themselves so French. So they left with the French. And there was also, I think also in Algeria it was different to distinguish between Jews and French Jews and French. So this also makes a change.
Well, I have Behet and then Aaron.
Okay, I have a question for Professor Samuel. You talked about the content of the stories that you read, and can you say a little bit more about the style? Is there anything Jewish about the style? This is a period that Jews are struggling in, at least in Hebrew literature, to find a new voice, a new style. Is it happening also in these novels?
Okay, I'm going to try. I guess maybe this does work. So that it's interesting because what I really found, the answer is yes, a little bit. So there's some attempt by the Orthodox writer Ben Baruch to use kind of Talmudic parables and to try to reinvent them, but very little. In fact, what's really going on is that they're engaging with these French literary genres and forms, but all different ones. So it's very, very interesting. So Ben Baruch himself, the Orthodox guy, goes to the Enlightenment. So he borrows from Montesquieu, for instance, from the Persian letters, as I said, and has these sort of satiric Enlightenment kind of things. Whereas Foa is borrowing from Walter Scott, from these sentimental novels, Ben Lévy from more realist, from Balzac. He's writing scenes of contemporary manners. So it's really what I was struck by was the Frenchness of these. That's what, as a scholar of, I am a French literature scholar, but I was really, really struck by that. And no, like there isn't, there's very little, there's a little bit, as I said, but not that much of an attempt to kind of reinvent Jewish literary forms in that sense. Is that what you're asking? Or? Yeah.
And in addition, if I
Yeah.
intertextuality with other Jewish texts to put it in a double context, in the context.
Yeah, a little, maybe a little bit, but not really. It's more, really kind of showing a kind of anchoring in, a contemporary French context much more. So, but yes, they're biblical, some biblical intertexts, but less than I was expecting, I think is the answer. I kind of expected that it would be more, that there would be more.
Yes, I have a question for both of the speakers because it's a point of convergence that I'd like to explore a little bit more, and that's the place of nostalgia in identity construction. Because obviously both in the Moroccan case of the Moroccan Jews who left Morocco in terms of creating a particular identity which is specifically Moroccan wherever they've gone, and in a very different context, creating a particularistic identity as we now call ethnic, as a minority within a university's kind of construct. There is a whole room and a whole kind of elaboration on the theme of nostalgia. And nostalgia can be double-edged, and in some ways, and the two cases are dramatically different, but I'd like to, I don't want to make this too long, but I'd like to point out two things, which is that in cases where communities leave a place, nostalgia can be both positive and negative, but can operate as a major ingredient in the creation of an identity, because most of the time the negative gets to be forgotten by the departing community, although it can be also very formative. So the most common examples are obviously the paradoxical nostalgia for the shtetl in the Russian Jewry versus the pogrom of the place that is left. So it's negative and the positive. And it seems to be less acute in Jews from Arab lands in the same sort of way, although depending on political circumstances, the negative can be easily accessed, but there's a positive nostalgia. Now, in the other case, where there is a kind of a world gone by, 2 generations, a village, and of course we have the exact equivalents in Auerbach's Dorfjuden and Germany and elsewhere. And eventually we'll go to Russia, the shtetl, etc., all that kind of construction, which is really also nostalgia. In both cases, they form negative and positive sources of identity construction in different kind of cases. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, because I think it's sort of, we take a lot of it for granted because without necessarily exploring what nostalgia means. What is exactly nostalgia? Because while there's a large literature of memory and collective memory, there's very little really on what is nostalgia, both in its historical, sociological, and literary implications. And I think that both of you have touched upon this in making of a certain specificity. So I would like to hear what you would like, how you would elaborate upon that particular strand of your reflections on what you think.
Yes, yes, it's true, and it's a very interesting question because nostalgia can be positive or negative. And what I have found among Jews from Morocco, that the positive was more important than the negative, even if we could expect something different because of the conflict. So it's a little bit unexpected, and this help, I think, can help also to understand the new, what I call the end of the auto-censorships, end of the auto-censorship of writers, of Jews from Morocco. And this, like in the novel of Sami Berdugo, for instance, the nostalgia helps in order to create. So it's a strong feeling to construct new, also art, and it's according to me, it's very different from the case of the nostalgia for the shtetl, or because there, for instance, you have now pilgrimage to the east, East Europe, but they are pilgrimages especially to nothing, to no signs of the past. On the opposite, you have the pilgrimage of Jews from Morocco who find the places of memory. So this also changes the way of reconsidering. Yeah, you have. I thought you. So I think this is a different case, and this nostalgia for Morocco Jews sure is also, as everybody knows, something that reminds when they were young. So it's also linked with when they were young, and they were young in Morocco, but also reflects a different social context from the.
Just to follow up with each other, because it's linked, and I'll speak loudly. From the Moroccan side, Moroccan Muslim side, I wonder if there is any equivalent to what I've been able to observe further east, that's the Levant, Egypt, all the way to Turkey,
Yeah, absolutely. Among the intellectuals, you can find this kind of feelings of regret because Jews represent one important component of the multicultural society, like Berbers, so they still are Berbers, but once they were Jews. And the lack, there is the feeling of the lack of the presence of Jews. So this I found among many intellectuals, absolutely, yeah.
So, in the last chapter of my book, I try to think about this question a little bit. And, one of the main theories of nostalgic the role of nostalgia in the Jewish tradition is that Jews who, the next generation of Jews, after the ones who leave the shtetl, feel this kind of nostalgia, and that it's Richard Cohen's theory is that it's working out their guilt feelings, basically, for having rejected the world of their parents and for their assimilation. So then they turn back. This is the Fiddler on the Roof phenomenon. Why did Fiddler on the Roof become such a huge hit in just the moment in the 1950s in America that the children of immigrants were making it? That, and his theory is that it's a way of kind of working out guilt about assimilation. And I think that, probably that might be true, although it's a little bit hard to, read the minds of people, and what they were really thinking, but there's probably some of that going on. And in France, it was, 100 years before this was this was happening. But what I decided to really kind of focus on was the different political uses to which nostalgia is put in different contexts. That I found kind of more interesting in a way than this psychological explanation. And I found that there are a lot of very different ones. So I think one use, as I said a little bit in the talk, is to try to create a new sort of solidarity or identity among Jews in the present who've lost a religious affiliation. So this idea that by talking about suffering in the past, and that's especially, I think, the texts that are, I hate to use nostalgia as that term, but in a way it is, for like the Inquisition. There's an obsession with the Inquisition, especially among Ashkenazic Jews in the 19th century, and this idea that our ancestors, who weren't even our ancestors, for the most part, were suffered for being Jews, and that they wanted to hear about this and read about this. And I think it was kind of trying to give Jews a new reason to be Jewish in the present, in the absence of. So I think that's one use. And then there were other kind of interesting uses I found too, more specific uses. So some of the writers I talk about use nostalgia to make Jews feel bad about the traditions they've lost in the present. So Ben Levi, one of these writers, one of his stories was Memoirs of a Jewish Peddler written by himself. And it was in the 1840s, and it was supposed to be written by a Jewish peddler who was 100 years old in 1840, talking about his childhood in the old regime. And yes, it was true, we suffered, but we also had family Shabbat dinners, and it was this sort of warm, wonderful thing, and we had tradition, and we had family, and you modern Jews don't know anything about that and have lost it. So I think that's one use of nostalgia. And another one I found, and I'll just end with that, is to kind of enter into this debate about whether Jews need to be regenerated or not, and whether traditional village Jews are backward, or whether they actually have the sort of seeds of a kind of modernity and are actually more pure and better than modern Jews. So there's a lot of kind of ghetto nostalgia, or nostalgia for these small-town Jews, like in the Scène de la vie juive en Alsace by Stauben, where he really cleans up these villages. So there's no, as they some commentator at the time said, you don't see any mud on the clothes of these village Jews. You know, they're not quite peasants in like a Watteau painting, but almost, you know, and they speak very pure French, and they have, you know, and they're not superstitious, and they have all these kind of, you know, good qualities. And so I think that's kind of entering into a debate within the Jewish community and using nostalgia for that very specific purpose.
So